Well, greetings everybody. Welcome back to our course. This is our next class on ad hoc international criminal tribunals. And generally when I talk about ad hoc tribunals, I'm referring to the international criminal tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. There are other hybrid tribunals that we'll discuss later in Sierra Leone, Kosovo, East Timor, and elsewhere that attempt to combine local and international trials. But for now, we're transitioning from our discussion about national trials into ad hoc tribunals before we come in our next and ultimate class to the International Criminal Court. So the first thing to understand about the ad hoc tribunals is that they were established by the Security Council to focus specifically on Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, this in the 1990s, and therefore they are quite different from the International Criminal Court and from other international institutions like the International Court of Justice. So let me tell you, as is my custom, what I hope to cover with you today. So the first objective that I wanted to announce so that we know where we're going is that you should emerge with an understanding of how and when ad hoc tribunals emerged, an appreciation of some of the sort of politics that went into that process is significant. We've discussed that in the past, but I want to flesh that out a little bit more. I want you to appreciate the different purposes assigned to these institutions and how these purposes differ from earlier iterations of international criminal justice. So what was the task assigned to ad hoc tribunals and how did that compare to Nuremberg, Tokyo, and also post-World War I trials? I want you to understand the political implications of these trials, particularly as attempts at transcending victors' justice. One of the theses that I shared with you at the very beginning was this idea that each new iteration of international criminal justice has attempted to overcome some of the flaws of the previous, and yet, as we'll see with ad hoc tribunals, they have obvious limitations of their own. And it's dubious whether the system can follow this type of narrative to produce a global system of justice. This we already anticipated with Schwarzenberger at the beginning. But I want you to see how ad hoc tribunals are an attempt to transcend ideas and criticisms of victors' justice at Nuremberg and Tokyo. I also want you to think about alternatives to ad hoc tribunals. And I want you to consider these alternatives in an attempt to isolate their role and contribution as forms of justice. What we'll see is that potentially by considering the alternatives that were available at the time, we have different ways of responding to criticisms from a more critical perspective, as we saw in the previous class. But still, that important criticisms remain, and some of them are structural and exceptionally difficult to overcome. I also want to talk to you about law. We've had a whole class now on retroactive application of law, and we've talked a little bit about how laws changed from one manifestation of international criminal law to the next. I want to highlight for you again how this took place in ad hoc tribunals and how they struggled with similar sorts of issues. How in the end, ad hoc tribunals were in many respects very progressive, largely because of interpretive work that judges did. But in other instances and other aspects, ad hoc tribunals were highly regressive relative to what came before, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that regression also. Finally, I want to develop an understanding of sort of rationale for and against ad hoc tribunals based on their record. So how would we judge these? How should we think about these institutions in consequentialist terms? Did they meet their objectives or not? That's a very big subject and probably an entire course you could dedicate to precisely that question. But I want to give you some sort of orientation around arguments for and against these ad hoc tribunals. So let's start by discussing the advent of ad hoc tribunals. And again, I have a series of questions that I'll pose and then answer to keep us organized and also to give you an opportunity to reflect before I start weighing in. So the first idea that I want to present to you is an idea that major manifestations of international criminal law have emerged after major wars. And that would stand to reason. We saw after the First World War, trials in absentia in France and Belgium, and vanquished justice in Leipzig in Germany, and all of the sort of attendant discussions around ideas of trying the Kaiser and International Tribunal and all of their complexity. All iterations of those attempts at justice, I think, were widely regarded as failures. And so the Second World War was the second major war, and the response to these criticisms of the First World War were a very important aspect of what made justice in the form of international tribunals possible after the Second World War. The ad hoc tribunals fit within that narrative also. They fit within that narrative because they followed the end of the Cold War. And the Cold War was very important in this sort of narrative because it essentially stalled ideas that were announced after the First and Second World Wars that, now we will have a system of global criminal justice to deal with the absurdity of atrocities. Now is the moment where we will promulgate and make real this particular idea about international criminal justice. And yet the Cold War forestalled that. There were exceptions. The Eichmann trial was one. Another of the exceptions were the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which we discussed last time. But nonetheless, there was a wide perception that over the 50 to 60, slightly less, nearly 50 years since 1945, that almost nothing really happened in international criminal justice, and that the idea was available to be resurrected and championed anew at the end of the Cold War. So, as a consequence of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the world rapidly found itself in a unipolar world where the United States held all the cards. Suddenly, the ability of other nations on the Security Council to withstand American political pressure was marginal. Suddenly, the idea that other states had veto power on the Security Council was formal only, and there was little political power to back it up. And as a consequence, the United States had free rein to construct a global order in an image that it found preferable. And in the political sweet spot between the fall of the Berlin Wall and September 11, 2001, so 12 years over that period, that sweet spot, if you're interested in international criminal justice, a lot of people will say that the United States used it to instantiate an entire series of neoliberal institutions, of which international criminal law is one. But if you are favorable about international criminal tribunals and courts, this was a very fertile period where suddenly the United States could use the Security Council to create new institutions. Now, we've discussed in a previous lecture the audacity of that process, both politically and legally. Legally, as we mentioned, there's nothing in the UN Charter that suggests that the Security Council has the power to create an international court or tribunal. Admittedly, there's nothing that says it doesn't, but this move was entirely unprecedented, needless to say, and left a few people with jaws dropped to the floor. I mean, imagine it now if in Australia or Canada or New Zealand, the Security Council announced the establishment of an international tribunal that was ad hoc, that had the power to reach into the state, and power that was legally superior to law within the state, to address some hyper-controversial issue that nonetheless required addressing, like, say, crimes during colonialism in each of those countries. You can imagine how this would be received within certain constituencies within the state, within the polity. It was a bold move that had important significance. In the case of the Rwanda Tribunal, one of the second institution that the Security Council established in 1994, the Rwandan government voted against it on the Security Council at the time. So there's a strong sense that this was a sort of an imposition. And because it's an imposition, we have to think really carefully about its legitimacy and the appropriateness of what's taking place under the aegis of peace and security. It's very important for you to, in your understanding about ad hoc tribunals and your ability to situate them within a broader family of international criminal trials, that you appreciate their jurisdictional limitations. And I guess the key jurisdictional limitations are geographic. So the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, established in 1993, has jurisdiction only over crimes perpetrated in the former Yugoslavia. It also has a temporal jurisdiction, which doesn't create an upper limit, but creates a lower limit of 1991 in order to preclude sort of a retroactive inquiry into atrocities that may have taken place long time ago in history. In the Rwandan case, the geographic limitation isn't expressly limited to Rwanda, but it is temporarily limited to crimes that took place in 1994. In a way, all of these limitations are arbitrary if your concern is justice. I mean, immediately after the Rwandan genocide, there were huge refugee flows into the Congo, which we looked at when we talked about armed conflicts, and massive violence erupted especially in 1996 as a direct continuation of the Rwandan genocide. But to a large extent, these things don't just pacify themselves immediately. There are very long-term consequences of this violence. So to limit things to just 1994 is, if your concern is global justice, is entirely random. It's a way of containing the reach of institutions and international criminal law in important ways. But nonetheless, those limitations are pivotal in generating a political appetite to create these institutions. And at the time, they are very novel. And to a large extent, I suspect that we wouldn't be having this course without those institutions. They were pivotal in generating a degree of interest and concern that has lasted several decades. And I also wanted at the very beginning to give you a summary of the records of these institutions, largely because I think it sort of builds an image before we go and discuss details about their functioning and the law that they adopted. So I've just created links that I'll show you to these two websites that summarize first the number of cases and a sort of a breakdown of the verdicts from the Yugoslav tribunal, and then there's a similar one for the Rwandan tribunal that we'll look at momentarily. So as you see here, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia indicted 161 individuals, 90 were sentenced, 2 are awaiting transfer to a state, 20 are transferred to a state, 59 have served their sentence, 18 were acquitted, 3 are ongoing, 37 accused had their indictments withdrawn, and so on and so forth. So you get a good snapshot of the extent of the work. The equivalent is here for the Rwanda Tribunal, 93 individuals indicted, 62 sentenced, 14 acquitted, and so on and so forth. So you recognize, I guess, in each of these instances a relatively substantial number of cases, and yet very expensive over the course of 2 decades, both of those institutions, several billions of dollars at certain junctures. Those two ad hoc tribunals took up 13% of the UN's budget, when, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, 4% of the UN's budget was spent on human rights for the world globally. And so a lot of people will look at those statistics and think, well, that's an absurd prioritization. If you'd done more about human rights, perhaps you wouldn't have had these sorts of problems. And still others that would say, yeah, but listen, this at least created a new form of accountability and enforcement with teeth, because previously it had just been hortatory. It had just been, oh, human rights, sure. Yeah, we're into them. At least now there was some degree of accountability, and that this was a sort of a bold step in fulfilling a legacy that dated at least to ideas of an international criminal court that we'll look at in just a moment, from the mid-19th century. So interesting dynamics already at the creation of these ad hoc tribunals and their work over the ensuing 20 years. Oh, I'm excited to talk to you about the purposes of ad hoc tribunals, because I think this is a very interesting discussion that doesn't take place all that frequently in practice, is my experience, but that I think is crucially important. And so I wanted to start by talking to you a little bit more about the purposes of previous iterations of international criminal law after the First World War and the Second World War. And there are several I want to go through with you to sort of set the scene to discuss something that's pretty significant that takes place at ad hoc tribunals, which really wasn't a meaningful concept or a meaningful purpose available in earlier iterations. So let me start by telling you more about some of the purposes of trials prior to ad hoc tribunals. One, obviously, that was explicitly referenced both after the First World War and the Second World War is retribution. What's really fascinating about the way we think about retribution is, I think we tend to think about retribution in very negative views. We tend to think it's harsh and about anger and blame, and but actually, and maybe that's because of our sort of a human rights sensibility, I'm not sure, but actually if one looks into the philosophy of retribution and looks into retribution from a criminological perspective, one sees that it's a dominant means, a dominant justification for criminal punishment presently, that there have been different periods where we moved out of retribution and thought about punishment as a gateway for sort of social rehabilitation and things like that. But there were very important human rights type arguments against using criminal law for those sorts of consequentialist ends. And so in criminology, retribution is a far more defensible view than we hear of it in human rights circles and in public international law. And certainly it was an overt justification for trials after the First World War and the Second World War. Retribution means we will adopt a proportionate punishment to what was inflicted, and we will do this in a way that treats what these individuals deserve as the primary consideration. And so, to make this practical, I think retribution is worth trying to concretize. Retribution is the underlying aspiration that you feel, I think, when you finished reading the first 4 pages of the doctor's judgment, the medical case at Nuremberg, and you're really shocked. And then you find out that Mengele, the chief architect of this program, lived out his days swimming on the beach of Brazil. And the feeling I think you have is, no, that's not right. That guy should be punished. It's not right that you get to do that. Well, I haven't told you anything about the consequences of him not living out his days. Your intuition is a moral intuition that's based on retribution. It's a moral attribution idea that no, he deserves to be punished. And it's that intuition, I think, that grounds victims' approaches that we saw in the Harbre case. It's like, no, I'm going to dedicate my life to holding these people accountable. Why? Because what they did is so transgressive. Again, it's the sorts of ideas that motivated Fritz Bauer in the Auschwitz trial. It's the sort of thinking that motivated Simon Wiesenthal and many others. Notice how in all of these justifications, there's no real statement yet of like, oh, deterrence, or we really have to make sure this never happens. It's again, those sorts of consequentialist arguments, although probably very important to people's justifications, are outside this core notion of no, that guy needs to be punished. Likewise, the film I showed you from Marathon Man of the Nazi escaping and then killing someone in the streets, a lot of people have a strong moral sentiment that that person should be punished. Those sentiments play out in each iteration of international criminal justice by people generating what I call moral absurdities. And so in World War I, there were a lot of people saying, well, like the Kaiser, if he walked into Belgium and shot someone dead, he'd be arrested and hanged. It's like, but we're just going to let him off and let him live out his life in a castle in the Netherlands because he sent 1 million men to do exactly the same thing? But he sent 1 million men. It's worse. So why would we suspend normal sort of ideas of punishment when someone does something even worse? We see these ideas of moral absurdity all the time. Robert Jackson, the prosecutor at Nuremberg's opening speech, says, oh, the only thing that the defendants can possibly hope for is that our idea of moral accountability, that international law has fallen so far behind our ideas of moral accountability that they'll be able to essentially get off on a technicality. Well, that's morally absurd. And I'll tell you another one from the intervening period in the Cold War momentarily. Notice that these ideas of moral absurdity are closely related to your retributive ideas. People deserve to be punished for this stuff. It's so bad. Then there are ideas about deterrence, and these have played out in different ways throughout all of this history. Really, we need to punish these people so it never happens again. And we need to create barriers. It might not be perfect, and maybe it'll happen from time to time, but we need to make it harder to do this. And we need to minimize the extent to which these atrocities take place. And if we have to spend billions to do that, then that's necessary, because if you know what happened in Kravica warehouse from our lecture that we discussed on genocide in Bosnia, then you will know that money is really a secondary consideration given the human experience of some of the things that we're talking about. And finally, some of the previous motivations for international criminal law are simply to incapacitate people. It's like, well, in order to avoid this, we really have to get the Kaiser behind bars so that he can't rise up and do this again, or Napoleon, or Goering, or whoever it is. So all of these different motivations play out. Another one that I haven't actually listed here is regime change and demonization of a particular ideology. We saw that in our discussions about show trials and how there were attempts to use the pedagogical, expressive function of trials in such a way to effectively serve an historical propagandizing function. And potentially this was trying to be harnessed in ad hoc tribunals as well, but for different purposes that we'll come to now. Oh, I'm excited to tell you about the moral absurdity that was used really very extensively by the human rights community during the Cold War period. Because what you have to remember about the Cold War period is that to a large extent, there are a number of atrocities taking place because the Cold War is only cold in a very small number of countries. For the vast majority of the world, the Cold War is very hot as superpowers, funnel weapons into all sorts of different places based on their ideological leanings, one way or the other. No shortage of mass violence in the Cold War, or during the period between 1945 and 1993 when the ad hoc tribunals materialized. And I mean, where to start in that violence? Algeria, Vietnam, the process of decolonization, for instance, hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Algeria. Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which was the subject later of a hybrid tribunal we can discuss, and so on and so on. So much violence. And in particular, violence like that we saw in the Fujimori trial. In particular, in Chile, the case against Augusto Pinochet, then dictatorship over that course, was one of the sort of the watershed moments where he was advocates attempt to have him indicted in Spain, and there was a very important case that took place in Britain when he was receiving medical treatment there about whether Spain could exercise universal jurisdiction over him for a series of crimes that took place throughout the world and in Chile during his dictatorship. And again, these crimes were like Operation Condor, for instance, was an assassination program that Pinochet orchestrated of Chilean dissidents and their supporters throughout the world. People were being executed throughout the world for opposing Pinochet. And the extent of forced disappearances during this period by Pinochet is astonishing. And as I've referenced in different lectures, Pinochet is dropping people out of planes at high altitudes to simply just disappear their bodies. So over this period, the moral absurdity that the human rights community seizes upon to point out the total or near total absence of accountability over that period. It's hard to get your mind around that as a concept. It's like, oh, there's this dude dropping people out of planes and assassinating people all around the world, and there's absolutely no consequences for doing that. It's amazing. And so this is the absurdity. I call it the Geneva absurdity. It says, well, if you kill one person, generally you have a trial and you go to prison for a substantial period of time. If you kill 10 people, you'll have a trial. Usually you'll go to prison for the rest of your life, and in some places you'll be subject to the death penalty. But if you kill 10,000 people, you're invited to Geneva for peace talks. And so the idea in this absurdity, which is sort of everywhere over the period, is that, oh, well, that's just ridiculous. There's no concept of accountability in that, and we need to generate that sense of accountability and fulfill a sort of a trajectory announced after the First World War, and especially after the Second World War. And yet there's a new purpose that emerges with ad hoc tribunals that's very interesting to think through and crazy ambitious. That new purpose is reconciliation. Now notice how there's really no discussion of reconciliation prior to ad hoc tribunals, because the justice was always imposed. If there was a reconciliation to be had, it was on the terms of the victors of the war, But because it was the Security Council of the United Nations that was for the first time attempting to be a neutral party and to cure this idea of victor's justice by being a neutral party and adjudicating claims on both sides, there was this possibility that this institution assigned itself to reconciling warring factions. Now, That, ladies and gentlemen, is a spectacularly ambitious project. You remember my prosecutor teacher, I took a class from someone who had been the lead Belgian prosecutor in the Boutare 4 case many moons ago. And this prosecutor would sometimes yell, "What would you do in the same instance?" And an equally demanding question, which you might also want to yell, is, well, how forgiving are you exactly? And like, think about your life generally. I mean, if someone has transgressed and has done something wrong to you, how ready are you to forgive that person? Now, let's assume that let's amplify the transgression and test the model again. Like, the transgression now becomes, they killed your family in front of you. Well, how do you go against the new reality? How do you, if you test your own experience of the world against this amplified transgression? How do you emerge? I think most of us emerge pretty poorly. And so for an institution to assign itself that role seems exceptionally ambitious, at least in the short term. Maybe, like many things, the justification becomes more meaningful over the long term. But, these institutions, and this is a crucial piece, these institutions are miles away from the communities that they are serving. And so the notion that justice that is so distant, that's imposed without a real sensitivity to the cultural realities in the countries concerned, the idea that it could sort of somehow come in here and offer this nuanced understanding that is sufficiently compelling to both sides that they come together and join hands, both at the time and in hindsight, seems highly ambitious. Maybe objectionably ambitious, many would suggest. And so what I want to suggest to you again is that ad hoc tribunals were an attempt to cure the imperfections of previous manifestations of ICL, and that the ad hoc tribunals themselves had their own limitations, which we would look to in a permanent international criminal court, the subject of our next lecture, to cure. And the previous imperfections were obviously victors' justice. It was obvious that these tribunals were created by victors to punish their allies, and there was no real concept of neutrality or objectivity in the way this was going to take place. Ad hoc tribunals were an attempt to step away from that model to something that was more neutral. Whether they achieved that neutrality, I think, is the subject of some important doubt, but it was at least an attempt to cure the problem. They contained their own imperfections because they were so geographically limited and temporally limited. As we discussed a moment ago, those limitations were arbitrary relative to global justice, and therefore the idea of a permanent international criminal court that wouldn't be limited in those sorts of ways became something that was highly interesting to many people. So let's transition now to talk about the political implications of ad hoc tribunals. In a way, I feel like we've been skirting around these issues in different ways already. But I want to draw you back to one of our initial classes on the theory of international criminal law and Schwarzenberger's piece saying, listen, there are really inherent limitations of inserting a system of criminal justice into the current global order. In other words, the global legal order presently just isn't structured in such a way that a criminal law component can really function in any meaningful way. And to a large extent, I feel like the different aspects of our course, all of the different issues that we've been discussing throughout the course, have been ways of describing the distortions that arise by trying to insert criminal law into the global legal order as it presently stands. In other words, if I'm right in thinking about international criminal law or using a metaphor to think about it, which highlights sort of moral outrage on one hand versus political instrumentalization on the other, and to view these as sort of core tensions throughout the history, including at ad hoc tribunals. That tension is a function of trying to insert criminal law into the global legal order as it currently stands in states with primary authority, very horizontal formally, no sort of strong executive, no global legislature, and importantly, no police force. You think, oh, well, how on earth are we going to have a system of global criminal law without a police force? Well, we're going to have to rely on states. And so states will lend these ad hoc tribunals their police forces. So that's very convenient, and that might work nicely. But like, what about when states aren't on board with your project? I mean, your project is made necessary by the fact that states won't do this work themselves, won't or can't do this work themselves. So what about like when states are like, you know how you've like pulled out of thin air this legal notion that the Security Council can establish ad hoc tribunals, and you know how you've imposed that on our country to deal with issues that are hypersensitive locally, and you know how you've purported to give this institution primacy, i.e. superior legal authority over our own national legal systems. The truth is that's kind of a bit too much to swallow, and when you make a request to us, guess what? No, we're not going to comply. And normally in a criminal justice system, if like the state or some authority with power makes a request, you say, you know what? No. Usually the police come. And the problem with the absence of a police force is it becomes very difficult to objectively collect evidence. It becomes very difficult to objectively, to meaningfully protect investigators, no matter the content of their investigation. It becomes very difficult to arrest people. And as a function of all of these things, it becomes very difficult to safeguard the independence of the institution, because it's possible for states to hold the prosecutor ransom to some extent by saying, listen, if you prosecute these sorts of cases, we're not going to cooperate with you on anything, and then you won't actually have any work to do, and that'll be acutely embarrassing because it's super expensive, and you've got like 100 staff in these ad hoc tribunals, and when they have nothing to do, the institution tends to cannibalize itself. So, choose wisely. And this was true, and let me make this practical. So I'll tell you a story about the Rwanda tribunal. I think I mentioned it previously, but I want to suggest to you that this is a metaphor for a lot of different dynamics in international criminal justice. This phenomenon arises in a number of different places, and to a substantial extent, the International Criminal Law Court has struggled with it also. So I think I mentioned to you, the Rwandan genocide is up to 1 million victims brutally murdered, the vast majority of them Tutsi, but some also sympathetic Hutu. And it's ended by a Tutsi military force that emerges into Rwanda from Uganda. And there's a lot of evidence, well known, to suggest that Tutsi force, as it's expelling the genocidaire, kills 50,000 civilians. 50,000 people is a lot of people. And in order to remain true to its objective of neutrality and impartial justice, there is a sense that emerges in the Rwanda tribunal that, well, it does make sense that the vast majority of these resources go to address the genocide that took place. But we will prosecute someone for the 50,000 Hutu who are killed, the civilians who are killed as part of this process, right? I mean, it's a substantial number. And we need to do it precisely in order to ward off the idea that there is victor's justice. But the difficulty with that process is that, the government in power is representative of that constituency that's responsible. Exactly the problem that plagues international criminal justice all the time. Exactly the problem for which internationalization of institutions is necessary, because states capture law enforcement. States responsible for international crimes capture law enforcement. And so, there's a statement on the part of leadership within Rwanda. Listen, if you pursue this, we won't guarantee the security of your investigators. Not a single witness will ever travel to the tribunal in neighboring Tanzania, and we will never, ever arrest anyone and surrender them to the tribunal in order for them to stand trial. It's like, well, what do you do? And ultimately, the previous prosecutor named Carla Del Ponte was removed by the Security Council because she intended to bring these cases, reflecting the fact that many of these countries have powerful friends. So the politics are thick, and part of the political implications of these institutions have important ramifications for legitimacy and efficacy of the institution. So question 3 is a little bit of a trick question. It's a trick question because it's drawing heavily on our last class, where I talked a lot about different national prosecutions, and I tried to sort of suggest to you that what constitutes an international trial for international crimes, a trial for international crimes, is highly plural, very diverse. There are lots of different sorts of cases, and they exist in very different circumstances. And so I'm asking this question in 3, what lessons should we draw from this history of political implications in ad hoc tribunals for the field generally? It's a trick question because the answer is none. I'm reticent about an idea that there can be general conclusions about all of international criminal justice when there is such variation in the different manifestations of it between national and international trials. Nonetheless, this is a recurrent dynamic that institutions and the field should be very concerned about. I want to come now to discuss alternatives to prosecutions with you, because I think by thinking about alternatives to prosecutions, we also are able to reach a sort of a more nuanced and context-specific judgment about the appropriateness of institutions' work towards international criminal justice generally, and the work of ad hoc tribunals in particular. So the first question I have is about alternatives to prosecutions that were apparent after World War I and World War II. And I won't belabor these histories. I think they're really interesting. Let me start with World War I in particular. There's a strong sense after World War I that the best solution is to exile leaders who have been involved in international crimes, especially the Kaiser. And the model here is Napoleon. Napoleon gets exiled as a way of just ending the war and get the guy out of there. It's like a form of incapacitation. And this is a strong idea after the First World War. Also, there are, of course, pushes to try the Kaiser after the First World War in a retributive fashion. But there's also an idea in both the First and the Second World Wars that really just the easiest thing to do is to execute those responsible. Just shoot them. And it's so interesting that after the Second World War, there were very developed plans to execute 50,000 Nazis. And so I think that for my way of thinking, whatever we might think about Nuremberg, we should load into the consideration of the judgments we make about the institution that it saved 50,000 people being summarily executed. Now, some would say, if you go back to our show trials metaphor and the sort of continuity of Wisniewski and the Moscow show trials then into Nuremberg, say, well, if 50,000 people had been executed, many of them were hanged at the end of Nuremberg anyway, But if people had been executed, although that's grossly abhorrent, you wouldn't have the criminal law being instrumentalized to sell a particular message that was as highly propagandized. So you wouldn't be bastardizing the criminal law's attempts to construct a just system. There's a very famous quote by the Supreme Court of the United States in a letter to, I think, a president, where one of the judges on the Supreme Court says of his colleague Robert Jackson, who'd just gone to be the prosecutor at Nuremberg, said, listen, I don't mind so much what you do with the Nazis, but to dress this up as about law and justice is just far too sanctimonious for my sensibilities. I find it really quite disgusting that you're calling this justice. You're really undermining the concept. And so all of these ideas are apparent after the First and Second World Wars. They're all significant. Some of the things that emerge as alternatives to ad hoc tribunals, though, are also very significant and slightly different because of the different context. So the first idea is military intervention, i.e., remember the Genocide Convention that we discussed? And there's an obligation in the Genocide Convention to prevent and punish. And because of the prevent aspect of this, all of the Clinton administration at the time is referring to the situation in Rwanda as the G word, because to admit that it's genocide implies obligations to stop it. And for various reasons, American bodies had just been dragged through Mogadishu, and there was no domestic appetite for sending soldiers into Africa. Again, for many reasons, there was no political appetite to intervene in Rwanda. And, well, the consequences, the frightening consequences, are those we know. But then there's a way of thinking of International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia as a sort of a weak apology for having failed to military intervene. What really was necessary was putting an end to this violence immediately. But unfortunately, despite having a legal obligation to ensure peace and security, the Security Council just washed its hands of it. The New Zealand government held the presidency of the Rwanda Tribunal at the time, and the New Zealand representative who was chair described the decision on the part of the Security Council not to intervene in Rwanda as like asking the Jews to reach a ceasefire with Hitler. And so the passage of the creation of the ad hoc tribunal for Rwanda is very much a response, exists in the shame of having failed to do anything meaningful about it. After all of this sort of laudatory never-agains and things like that emerged after the Second World War, the Security Council fails to discharge its obligations. And so there's this interesting relationship with use of force and the advent of ad hoc tribunals. There's also an emergent paradigm that all of this criminal justice is really inefficient and won't promote reconciliation and social healing in meaningful ways, largely on the back of the South African model, but there'd been Truth and Reconciliation Commissions elsewhere also. There's a sense in which, what are you going to do? There's someone produced a statistic that in Rwanda there was so much offending that it would take all of the lawyers in America, by far the most lawyers of any country, it would take all of them 150 years to prosecute everyone responsible in Rwanda. So surely you need some mechanism that is able to cope with offending that isn't aberrational, that isn't deviant, but is widespread and mainstream. Surely a Truth and Reconciliation is a better place to do that. And there is something in Rwanda called Gacaca, which is an indigenous process we can discuss in questions if you like. That's an attempt to do that, but it creates a sort of a parallel system of justice, which is also complicated, and I'll tell you stories about that in a moment. It's also possible to do vetting, the sort of vetting that we saw taking place in the trial of Saddam Hussein, which in that particular instance was highly problematic because it was effectively removing judges and prosecutors from the trial as it took place, deeply undermining the independence of the institution. But that is nonetheless one way of changing the regime and promoting a transformation in the way it functions. And there's also exile. One of the cases we looked at last time was the case of Hissène Habré, who in 1990 moves from Chad to Senegal. And in a way, that type of exile that we saw with a number of different leaders around the world is also a means of thinking about how to deal with, individuals who are responsible for mass violence. And so, again, a little bit like my Nuremberg example with mass executions, I guess in the ways that we evaluate international criminal justice, we have to think about alternatives to prosecution, to sort of ascertain what was plausible, what was feasible at the time, what was on the table. And it might be that this was the best of an imperfect set of options, or it might be that really there were third options that were far better, and that this is a distraction which has served broader political ends that are mostly against justice, not conducive to it. So this brings us to the law applicable in ad hoc tribunals. I'm going to be a little bit quick with this section, but the first question is, what's the primary source of law that grounded the statutes of the ad hoc tribunals as promulgated by the Security Council? So again, to backtrack, the Security Council says, we're going to create this tribunal. We're really concerned about it not being victor's justice, and so we're really concerned about it applying pre-existing law. But still, we're going to promulgate a statute, and the statute has retroactive effect, and so we kind of have to need to appeal to some pre-existing branch of international law that was recognized as such at the times the crimes were committed, in order to not fall into exactly the same trap as Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. And so in order to do that, they say, here's the statute, but everything we have in the statute is reflective of customary international law. And so to the extent that it's not reflective of customary international law, courts should just refuse to apply those aspects that aren't consistent with customary international law. And as I say, this is an attempt to respond to the criticisms of Nuremberg and Tokyo as just having invented it. And in that context, you'll recall our full class on the retroactive application of criminal law and all of the controversies that surround it. A criticism of the way the ad hoc tribunals went about these problems is that really the shift was mostly rhetorical. We talked about a number of instances where they were like, yeah, listen, we really don't do what Nuremberg did, and Nuremberg said that like non-retroactivity is a principle to be applied, but really we've moved on from that in a big way. Nonetheless, we're going to do something that's never been done before and for which there's no formal authority. And so there was sort of like a double speak that took place, but nonetheless, at least at the level of appearances, there was an attempt to respond to Nuremberg and Tokyo. So having been a practitioner in international criminal law, my view is that this recourse to customary international law in practice was really quite absurd, because you would have like a concrete question about, whether in command responsibility, whether a commander who assumes command of a battalion that has committed crimes in the past, whether she can be held responsible for the battalion's crimes if she fails to punish them after she discovers them. And there's all sorts of complexity about that. Like, well, if you're going to try and answer that question in customary international law, you have to have uniform state practice. And so, and state practice is amorphous and can be a number of different things. For any given legal problem, it's not so much about interpreting a code, it's about taking a survey of like how governments throughout the world deal with these legal problems and trying to synthesize that into something that's workable. It's like, well, what sort of criminal trial is this? Is this based on standards that are strictly defined? It seemed pretty amorphous as a method to my way of thinking, and I think other people felt that way too. Oh, and this is a really good question in my view, and I think that's a question that tells something interesting about ad hoc tribunals. So while much of the law was interpreted in a very progressive fashion, much was also regressive. How? So what you'll recall is that leading up to the creation of ad hoc tribunals, rape was not even considered a war crime in international treaties. And so initially rape at the Yugoslav tribunal is charged as torture, but then judges play a very proactive role in interpreting a range of different aspects of international criminal law in a very broad way, such that women's experience of war is very much integrated into the ways in which crimes are defined, and there's an enormous progression that takes place at the behest of judges, which is important and leads to important changes that we see in the ICC statute and elsewhere. But there's also a regressive function, and there are two that I think I've gestured at, one of which we had a class on, and that is the absence of regression in the statute. There's no inclusion of aggression as a crime within the statute of either of these two institutions, which must seem a little bit bizarre given that Nuremberg called it the supreme offense and was largely preoccupied with that offense and that offense alone. And then also this idea that actually commerce is an important driver for atrocity, which really animated Nuremberg to the point that there was very nearly a second major Nuremberg trial just for business people. And the number of cases that took place in occupied zones throughout Germany after the war, all of these cases against business people that took place are not replicated in ad hoc tribunals at all. And so this strange moment where there's this meteoric rise of international criminal justice and prosecutions, and yet these two key features of the way it played out after the Second World War are left out. Why? Well, because of a different politics and different rationale and agenda that these institutions set itself. This brings us, I guess, to the last element of what I wanted to speak to you about today, and that's the consequences of ad hoc tribunals. The easiest thing, I guess, is to start by reiterating the statistics on verdicts that I began with at the ICTY and ICTR. But after you've seen these statistics, the question becomes, well, what sense do we make of them? How do we judge these things? What metrics do we use in evaluating whether this was a worthwhile investment for global justice or whether it was really quickly instrumentalized and became part of the problem? And what I think is interesting is that probably we have to employ again the purposes of international criminal justice to ascertain how successful it was in achieving and reaching those goals. I should have really emphasized earlier that one of the great criticisms of international criminal justice generally is that there are a multiplicity of purposes, many of which I've discussed, none of which is necessarily explicitly identified as a goal. There's no hierarchy between them, which is problematic when often they clash. And as a consequence of all of this, it feels a little bit sometimes like groping in the dark. We really don't know what goals we've assigned to ourselves, and therefore we don't know how to judge the consequences of the institution's creation. But let me go through some of them and offer you ideas for and against the creation of these tribunals. So if your goal is retributive, you can look at the statistics and say, oh, well, at least justice is done in some circumstances, depending on the quality of the procedure you perceive. And at least we've done something to undermine the moral absurdity, the Geneva absurdity that I described to you earlier. How on earth is it possible to let someone get away with things like this? They're too transgressive. And if you adopt a retributive thinking, which I think many people do without acknowledging it as such, then just the convictions and just the processes are significant. There are also ideas about deterrence once you move into a consequentialist realm, and there's very interesting empirical research by someone called Beth Simmons and also Catherine Sicking. Simmons' empirical research says that the International Criminal Court has demonstrable effect in deterring atrocities, which is really compelling, and I recommend it to your reading. Catherine Sicking's work on the justice cascade suggests that trials, especially in Latin America, that trials for international crimes have a demonstrable empirical effect on human rights performance, not just in the country concerned, but in surrounding countries also. It's like, oh, well, there's interesting empirical research. And there are various anecdotes that you can tell about these sorts of things. One of my favorite is that before the Iraq War, the chief of the army required in writing from the prime minister and attorney general that going to into Iraq militarily was legal. And when asked why, he said, because if I end up in The Hague, they're definitely coming with me. Now, that was all a little bit legally confused about aggression at the time. We know that aggression wasn't applicable. And even now, there must be some doubt about its relevance. But nonetheless, there are different moments where you see these ideas percolating and you see some degree of deterrence. That said, the contrary argument is that, you're just really fanning the flames, that all of these cases are just building grievances that will fester, and you're not really deterring anything by holding individuals accountable, because you're creating new grievances that people will seek to redress in subsequent generations the ways they have in so many instances of cyclical violence. So deterrence is hard to measure because you never know what crimes you don't prevent. And there's an interesting debate in both directions about whether ad hoc tribunals have done something of this sort. Reconciliation, as I say, I think it's difficult for one reason. The process of international criminal justice gives a podium to people who will use it to sort of continue the nationalistic rhetoric that got them into power and that placed them in situations of influence during a war. And Sheshel is one person at the ICTY who used it in very damaging terms, is ultimately acquitted, and then goes back to precisely the same place to continue sort of propagandistic messages. And it's sort of the fact that he was tried and acquitted is deemed to have only augmented his influence and validity. So, and is widely perceived by others as just a travesty, and a travesty that might replicate in effect, not in procedure, but might replicate the Stenger acquittal after the First World War, where France and Belgium just say, oh, this is ridiculous, we withdraw. Likewise, you have to wonder about reconciliation from the perspective of the Rwandan prisoner I spoke to you about in our last lecture, where this individual is a subordinate following rules of a superior who is most responsible. The subordinate is fully dangerous to him and family in refusing. After all, what would you do in a similar situation? And his conditions of detention are appalling. His legal representation is non-existent. The criminal justice system he faces has all sorts of very harsh penalties, whereas he looks at those most responsible in the ad hoc tribunal who are getting rich croissants and chocolate birthday cakes and AIDS retrovirals and immaculate, well, not immaculate, that's a foolish thing to say, but who are getting substantially more robust defense representation. And you start to wonder, well, how do all of these systems of justice come together to produce reconciliation? There's an equal chance that they might produce increased resentment. There's also interesting problems about unintended consequences, including reinforcing dictatorship and by focusing on one limited aspect of violence by actually augmenting violence in total. And there are different instances of that that we can discuss by way of questions. And then there's the broader question, which I alluded to earlier too, about, listen, this is several $1 billion went into these projects, and you could do a lot of good for a lot of different countries by redeploying that money into some other venture that really this is an unjustifiable amount of money. I think a lot of people have responses to that, which try and put things in perspective and say, actually, the amount that we're spending on international criminal justice is just ridiculously small given what we spend on other sorts of things. I don't know. I think although the ICTY cost about $200 million a year, someone said that in the Kosovo campaign, the military intervention in 1999, they spent more than that in half an hour, sending in warheads and flying sorties and things like that. So, maybe international criminal justice is the cheapest option we have for guaranteeing these sorts of things. Other people talk about, the Tokyo Fire Department having a greater budget. We'll get to discuss budgets more when we come to the International Criminal Court. There's also an idea that this sort of intense preoccupation with international criminal justice, especially from without in ways that's not necessarily sensitive to societal needs or desires, is effectively a way of crowding out alternative justice initiatives, be it truth and reconciliation commissions, compensation, things that actually might make a difference to the way people live their lives, undermined and marginalized relative to sort of like this big behemoth, which is impersonal and not able to calibrate itself adequately to realities on the ground. And then there's an argument that, listen, given that the record of who you're prosecuting, this really looks like a neo-colonial institution that is focused on justice for the weak, especially given all of the sort of maneuverings on the part of major powers to insulate themselves from similar sorts of responsibility. We used the word hypocrisy previously, and that hypocrisy likely translates into strong criticisms that this isn't actually about justice, it's about the continuation of old dynamics, just in different form. And you have African leaders in Rwanda and elsewhere explicitly criticizing international criminal justice as a neo-colonial instrument. So I hope I've put enough on the table to sort of provide you with a basis to think about ad hoc tribunals, to situate them within the broader scheme of what we've been discussing, and to sort of create a platform for us to have what I hope will be an interesting discussion now. Thanks so much.